Good day. Today is Wednesday, 21st January 2026, and before I proceed with this video, let me remind you to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. If, having watched the video, or whichever part of the video you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and wish to indicate this fact. Now, I am making this video today under some time pressure. Our child carer is unwell, and my wife also has serious work commitments. So most of the childcare today will devolve upon me, and inevitably this sharply reduces the time I have free in which to make programs. So there may be, this program will be shorter, probably significantly shorter than usual. Now, as I am making this program, after a short delay, President Trump is flying to Davos, and there will be no doubt a speech from him, and various meetings, and the crisis in Greenland is still underway. And yesterday, President Trump gave another one of his remarkable press conferences in which he gave lots of impressions that he's preparing something big, but said very, very little about it. I noticed that over the course of his press conference, he also refused to be drawn on the topic of security guarantees for Ukraine. And there is an article in the US media that I saw earlier today, which says that, which is written by people connected to Ukraine, in which they speak about the fact that President Trump and the US appear to have lost interest in the Ukraine conflict, and why, in some respects, from a Ukrainian point of view, that is a good thing, because they no longer have to rebuff various diplomatic initiatives that President Trump from time to time comes up with. In other respects, in more important respects, it is a bad thing because Ukraine realistically cannot continue to wage war without the backing of the United States. To say it straightforwardly, if the United States has indeed lost interest in Ukraine, then for Ukraine that is an unequivocally bad thing. They may have to spend time and effort dealing with President Trump's peace initiatives, but up to now, those peace initiatives have amounted to very little in substantive terms and have been tilted very much in Ukraine's favor. At least that's my view. And by contrast, US military support, intelligence support, supply of Patriot missile interceptors, all that kind of thing, even Patriot missile interceptors sent via third parties, has been absolutely critical in enabling Ukraine to continue with the war at all. But anyway, let's press on and say that the meeting in Davos is coming. Donald Trump is on his way. President Zelensky indicated yesterday, he confirmed that at the moment he was not proposing to go. He explained that the Russian missile attacks and the energy crisis in Kiev obliged him to remain where he was. This is very uncharacteristic of Zelensky, and in my opinion, if he really is going to skip Davos, almost certainly it is because he either doesn't want to meet Trump, because if he's afraid of what Trump may say, or more likely it is because Trump doesn't want to meet him and Zelensky doesn't want to be turned away from a meeting with Trump. But anyway, the Davos meeting is due to take place. There's lots of agonizing and worry about Greenland. There's worries about it in the financial markets. There's hand-wringing by the Europeans. Many European states are refusing to join the Gaza Peace Board, which some are saying President Trump envisages as a kind of alternative United Nations. But everything is in flux, and as President Trump hasn't spoken, I'm going to defer discussion of Davos, what's going on in Davos, and the Greenland topic until my next video when we have further clarity. The one thing I will say about Davos, about this meeting in Davos, is, well, how times have changed. 4 years ago, at the time of the Munich Security Conference in February 2022, I remember the gathering of the collective West in all its pomp. I remember the fiery speeches denouncing President Putin, talking about the imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine, talking about how the West would remain united in the face of this pending Russian aggression that everybody was talking about. I have discussed in many programs, in many places, how I got the distinct impression at the time that many of the participants in Munich in February 2022 were positively enjoying themselves. In fact, some of them seemed to me delirious with excitement at the prospect of the conflict that was to come and at the prospect of the massive sanctions that they were preparing to impose, which they were overwhelmingly confident would wreck the Russian economy and perhaps precipitate, in fact, definitely precipitate, a political crisis there. Well, 4 years later, there is again talk about a possible invasion of a European country, though the talk now is of the United States as the invader and Greenland as Greenland and Denmark as the victims. Instead of euphoria and excitement, well, there's plenty of excitement, but there is no euphoria. There is fear and gloom and despair. Prime Minister Starmer's attempts to be emolliating appear to be receiving increasingly ferocious responses from President Trump and some of his officials. There have been comments by Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, again insisting that Greenland must be part of the United States. The mood is completely different. It's the diametric opposite of what I remember in Munich in February 2022. It's extraordinary how things have changed, and, well, we'll see how real that change is after the speeches and the comments and the meetings that will take place today and perhaps tomorrow, and which I will discuss further in my program tomorrow. So today I'm going to focus on the situation in Ukraine, and before I begin, I'm going to briefly touch on a very interesting article by Gordon Hahn, in which he was kind enough to refer to me as perspicacious, which I am very grateful for. And may I also say that I also think that Gordon Hahn is one of the most perspicacious commentators on the Ukraine crisis that I know of. And you can find his article on his Substack site, and the article is entitled Putin's New Hard Line ? And in this article, Gordon Hahn pushes back against the suggestions that Vladimir Putin has, in fact, and the Russians have, in fact, hardened their position in the last few weeks, especially after the drone attack on Valdai. And he says that he hasn't really noticed any change in the Russian position, and he hasn't really noticed much change in the speech that Putin gave to the ambassadors who presented their credentials a short time ago, which I've discussed in various programs. And in this article, Gordon Hahn says that too much time and is given up to trying to understand the various diplomatic nuances, and about that he's undoubtedly right. Not enough time is given to focusing on the military developments. But he says that even in the military developments, though we see a steady ramp up by the Russians in the war, we see increasing efforts being put by the Russians, increasing power being exerted by the Russians against Ukraine. And about this, I absolutely agree. He says that this is not the sign of a new hard line on the Russians' part. Rather, it is part of the methodical, systematic strategy which the Russians have been following, the way they're stepping up the war. This is his last paragraph. I do not see an inordinate major escalation or new hard line emanating from Moscow. Rather, I see a continuation of Putin's sufficiently methodical, precisely targeted and well thought out strategy of destroying the Ukrainian army, its warfighting capacity, and the configuration of the current Maidan regime that persists in rejecting accommodation with Moscow at the West's behest. Now, I've because of time pressures, I've not quoted from the article, but I would urge people to read it and to compare it with what I've been saying in my programs. Gordon Hahn is, as I said many times, a very perspicacious and insightful commentator. And I think it's important to read the article to get, the full sense of what he's saying. Now, what can I say about this? The first thing I would say, however, is that it's always important in these matters to go back and look at what the Russians themselves have been saying. Now, after the drone attack on Valdai in Novgorod, there was a telephone call between Trump and Putin. This telephone call had been arranged in advance. The purpose of the call was for Trump to inform Putin about his meeting with Zelensky that had taken place just a few hours before. Trump, according to the Russians, told Putin that he had impressed upon Zelensky and the Ukrainians that there was no possibility of an interim ceasefire in Ukraine. Zelensky and the Ukrainians needed to forget about the ceasefire, focus on achieving a final settlement of the conflict, and that was the priority. And the Russians said that they were happy with that information from Trump, even though there were many, many aspects of the discussions between the Americans and the Ukrainians on diplomatic issues, which the Russians were not happy with. And the comments, this discussion, this description of the conversation between Putin and Trump was provided by Putin's foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov. And, well, these were the words that he gave about Trump's report to Putin about Trump's meeting with Zelensky. Donald Trump informed, so in their presentation, the US side took an assertive stance, this is with the Ukrainians, these are Ushakov's words, in promoting the idea that Kiev needs to take real steps towards the final settlement of the conflict instead of using demands for a temporary ceasefire as cover. Zelensky was advised not even try to secure a respite for his armed forces, but instead focus on achieving a comprehensive agreement that would lead to the actual end to the armed conflict. Donald Trump informed the president of Russia about certain results achieved by Zelensky's team precisely in this direction, but which nevertheless, in our assessment, that's to say in Moscow's assessment, still leave the Kiev authorities room for various interpretations in order to evade fulfillment of their commitments. So the Russians basically gave Trump here a B-. They said, well, we're pleased that you told Zelensky these things, but overall, there hasn't really been that much progress. It's good that you're trying, but you haven't achieved much progress. But then Ushakov went to say this. Vladimir Putin drew attention of his counterpart to the fact that practically immediately after what the US side considers a successful round of talks at Mar-a-Lago, the Kiev regime carried out an attack involving a barrage of long-range unmanned aerial vehicles, an attack on the state residence of the president of Russia in the Novgorod region, that is to say, Valdai. And then there's a discussion about how Trump said he was shocked by this attack. And then Ushakov goes on to say this. Vladimir Putin emphasized that the Russian side intends to continue close and productive work with its US partners, searching for ways to achieve peace. However, naturally, with regard to a number of agreements reached at the previous stage and the newly outlined solutions, Russia's position will be revised. This was stated very clearly, and the Americans should treat this with understanding. Since Kiev is using state terrorism, the Russian side cannot act otherwise. Now, these words seem to me to clearly signal a hardening of the Russian position. And according to Ushakov, they were communicated by Putin to Trump over the course of their telephone call, which took place on the 29th of December. To repeat again, with regard to a number of agreements reached at the previous stage and the newly outlined solutions, Russia's position will be revised. That is what Ushakov, who is listening in on the call, says Putin said to Trump. So, to me, the natural meaning of these words is that the Russians have already told the Americans, they told the Americans before the New Year and Russian Christmas holidays that they do intend to take a harder line in their negotiations because of the way in which the Ukrainians have been acting. Now, there is an intrigue about this, and it's one that, in fairness, I think I must make, which is that here again, we have the Russians indicating that over the course of previous talks, in Anchorage and in other places, they made certain concessions. They made certain concessions to the American side and to the Ukrainian side. I have found it very difficult to understand what these concessions actually were. I say this because in every statement that Russian officials have made since Anchorage, and I speak of Russian officials, I include Lavrov and Putin himself, they have repeatedly reiterated the demands, the terms that Putin outlined at the speech he made to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. I've never seen the Russians row back or retreat for any one of those terms. There was a brief flurry of reports that the Russians had told the Americans that if the Ukrainians withdrew their forces from Donbass, then the Russians would agree to a ceasefire in Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. But since then, the Russians have given strong reasons to doubt that this is the case. And if we look at the evolution of the situation on the front lines and the way in which the Russians have, it seems to me, prioritized the fighting in Zaporozhye region, especially. It doesn't look to me as if that is the case at all. The Russians are clearly now talking about Zaporozhye city as a military objective, and they are still talking, and have clearly been talking about Zaporozhye and Kherson, including the city of Kherson, being returned in full to Russia. So I am not sure what these concessions that the Russians are supposed to have been made, and they are clearly they have been repeatedly touching on and talking about. I am not sure what those concessions substantively and actually were. But anyway, put that aside. We have Ushakov's words to the media directly after a telephone call between Putin and Trump on the 29th of December, which says that the Russians intend to revise, which can only mean harden their positions in the light of what? In the light of the Valdai attack. And Ushakov directly linked that to the number of agreements reached at the previous stage and the newly outlined solutions. So that does seem to me to indicate a Russian intention to harden their stance. And then the next words, the other words to look at, are those of Putin himself in his speech to the ambassadors. And the relevant words, as far as I'm concerned, are these. First of all, he talks about the expansion of NATO, the fact that this took place completely disregarding Russia's objections and in breach of promises made to the Soviet Union and to Russian leaders at the time when the Soviet Union broke up. And he then went on to say, "Let me remind you that Russia has repeatedly put forward initiatives to build a new, reliable and fair architecture of European and global security. We have proposed options and rational solutions that could satisfy everyone in America, Europe, Asia, and across the world. We believe that it would be worthwhile to return to a substantive discussion of these proposals to establish the conditions under which a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine could be achieved, and the sooner the better." And, well, to me, again, what these words simply say, and again, I'm taking this from the Kremlin's own translation, is that the Russians are saying that a peace settlement in Ukraine is now linked, in fact has become conditional, on negotiations, on setting up, on creating a security architecture, obviously primarily in Europe, but one which clearly touches on security issues around the world. He refers to previous proposals that the Russians made. The last proposals on this topic that the Russians made were the two draft treaties they proposed in December 2021. To me, I have to say this, again, it looks to me as if the Russians are linking explicitly now the achievement of a peace settlement in Ukraine to a return to the discussions of the topics discussed in those treaties, which, as I've said, were NATO expansion and its reversal, at least in terms of military deployments, back to the start positions, not by the way of 1991, but of 1998, when NATO expansion, essentially military expansion and political expansion, basically began. So, again, that seems to me the natural and obvious meaning of these words. And given that the Russians have never at any time before linked a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine to the negotiation for a security, the renegotiation of a new security architecture in Europe so directly, and given what Putin said to Trump, according to Ushakov, over the course of their telephone conversation on 29th December 2025, about the Russians revising their terms. It seems to me that this basically signals how the terms are going to be revised, how the Russians are going to revise their terms, the terms of negotiation from this point on, from this point going forward. The Russians now saying that focusing specifically on the conflict in Ukraine is no longer enough. We must look at the entire security architecture in Europe, and the two go together. And in the course of his comments to the ambassadors, Putin said that for him, as far as he was concerned, the sooner the negotiations on this topic began, the better. He clearly wants negotiations to discuss the security system in Europe to begin as soon as possible. Now, what is interesting about these words is, of course, all of these comments made by the Russians began before the Greenland crisis really began to take off. And, well, when Putin said this, I was incredibly skeptical, and I remain, by the way, very skeptical, that the Senate in its current configuration would ever agree to a treaty which would in effect bring about the dismantling of NATO's military infrastructure in Eastern Europe and its withdrawal to the positions that it had in 1998. In fact, I thought it inconceivable. But since then, of course, we've had the Greenland crisis. And suddenly, the topic of the collapse of NATO, the imminent collapse of NATO, is all over the place. The Europeans themselves, or some of them, have been talking about closing all the American bases in Europe as retaliation if the Americans seize Greenland. There's rumours and talk about an American invasion of Greenland and how that would be the death of NATO. It's all over the media now. And the Americans themselves have been quietly taking steps to start withdrawing some of their infrastructure from Eastern Europe. they've already pulled back forces from Romania. There were reports this morning that the Americans are scaling down their involvement in some other NATO structures as well, again because of time constraints. I've not been able to follow this up fully. So what seemed absolutely inconceivable on the 29th of December when Putin and Trump had this call suddenly looks a little marginally, and I don't want to overstate this, marginally more possible. And, well, I'm going to engage in a little bit of imagination now, because I don't really believe this is going to happen. But let us say over the next couple of days or weeks or months, there is an American invasion of Greenland. The Americans have the troops to do it. The Europeans don't. As many people have pointed out, when the Germans deployed troops to Greenland in support of the Danes, the moment Trump indicated that he was cross about it, the Germans, within a day, scuttled back, saying that their forces weren't adapted to the difficult weather conditions in Greenland. So, possibly we have a crisis, possibly there's going to be a rupture in NATO, and all of those sort of things. Well, might that not open up political space for a negotiation with the Russians about the security architecture in Europe? The Americans have Greenland. So, in a sense, as I discussed in my program yesterday, from their point of view, the situation in the North Atlantic is secure. The Russians are wrapping up Ukraine. Trump, rather incredibly, over the course of his press conference yesterday, spoke about the Caucasus being Putin's. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but you could almost see that he's basically telling Azerbaijan and Armenia, well, we're not really there for you. I don't want to overanalyze Donald Trump's words. But anyway, suddenly, in the event of a crisis in NATO, especially if things begin to go badly wrong over the next few weeks, which I don't expect, to make this very clear, it might be that a negotiation about a new security architecture in Europe between the Americans and the Russians suddenly becomes relevant. And it might be the case that in those sort of circumstances, European opposition is not going to be quite as coherent as it might otherwise have been. I'm not saying that a renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe as a result of the Greenland crisis is achievable. I am just saying that it is perhaps just possibly becoming imaginable. Some people might even go so far as to say that maybe, just possibly, given that the Russians are now floating the possibility, or are now refloating the issue of a renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe, and given the realities of the situation in Ukraine, creating the space for that negotiation is precisely what the Greenland crisis is ultimately about. That the United States, in effect, that the Trump administration is doing this, to some extent at least, for that very reason. I would make it absolutely clear that I don't believe that myself. Donald Trump has been talking about Greenland for years. He started talking about it in 2019. I don't believe that this is a route towards negotiating a renegotiating the security architecture in Europe. But, well, we are in extraordinary times, and I'm just going to put the thought out there. It is only a thought. Anyway, that's how the situation looks to me. Now, again, to be clear, there are uncertainties. Putin has only been back for a couple of days. We will see what comes out of Davos. Dmitriev is there. He's going to be speaking to Witkoff and Kushner. There's no word from the Russians yet about when these two gentlemen are supposed to be coming to Moscow. There's no word yet what they're going to bring with them when they actually go to Moscow. There's this enormous cluster and confusion of diplomatic initiatives and plans and all kinds of things. I completely agree with Gordon Hahn in this respect, that, as I said, too much time has been devoted to all of this. But anyway, we will see where this is going, in what way the Russians have hardened their position, if they have actually done so. And we will see whether negotiations over a new security architecture ever get started, and what the situation in terms of Greenland really is going to be. So a lot of balls are up in the air, and that is why, as I said, especially over Davos and the events in Davos, I'm deferring my discussion until we know a lot more than we do now. Now, that is one thing. There has been another article which is attracting a great deal of attention, and this is an article by the celebrated and justly celebrated investigative reporter Seymour Hersh. And this article, which you can also find on Seymour Hersh's Substack blog, is called Putin's Long War. And this article is an article that tells us something completely different, and which I have to say I found myself extremely disturbing. Now, I am not going to discuss this article in detail. Others have done so. If you want a critical examination of this article, Scott Ritter has written a powerful refutation of it on his Substack site, and I'm not going to repeat all the points Scott Ritter makes. Briefly, in his article, which is based on advice that Seymour Hersh has been giving by a US official, Seymour Hersh says that the American intelligence community believe that Russia is on the ropes, that its army is close to collapse, that its economy is close to collapse, that the war in Ukraine is being prosecuted because of the fanaticism of President Putin and his obsessions, which the Americans are having difficulty understanding, given the crisis that Russia is in, and that they are baffled and mystified why Putin rejected the offer that was so favorable to him, which Donald Trump made in the autumn, which was to all intents and purposes for a freeze of the conflict on the existing conflict lines. Now, I don't recognize this picture of Russia anywhere that Seymour Hersh is describing. I don't recognize this picture of Russia in terms of the economic data that I have seen. I've discussed that in many places. And I absolutely do not recognize the description of the state of the military that Seymour Hersh, the Russian military, that Seymour Hersh is giving. I would add that no less a person than General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, who was given a massive interview recently, speaks of the Russians recruiting an extra 11 divisions this year, and of having millions of men in reserve, millions of trained men in reserves. That doesn't seem to me like it suggests an exhausted army close to collapse or anything like that. Syrskyi also grudgingly admitted that the Russians have a decisive advantage in the war in the sky, and he also admitted that the Russians are well ahead of the Ukrainians in fiber optic drones, and that is an important fact which I have discussed in previous programs, but I don't have the time to touch upon now. And of course, to repeat again, it is Ukrainian cities that are now in blackout, not Russian ones. So where this crisis that the American intelligence community, this crisis in Russia that the American intelligence community believes in, and which Seymour Hersh has been told about comes from, I personally don't see. I also have to say that I was left gasping when I read this paragraph. Putin knows the ghost in the Kremlin closet, this US official said, is revolution. So this seems to threaten Putin with revolution because the situation in Russia is so bad. But then the US official goes on to quote General Gerasimov. These are the exact words. The official quoted General Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of staff, and this is purportedly a direct quote from Gerasimov. I no longer have an army. My tanks and armoured vehicles are junk. My artillery barrels worn out. My supplies intermittent. My sergeants and mid-grade officers dead. And my rank and file ex-convicts. Well, quite apart from the fact that this bears no relation, no resemblance to the realities on the ground, as I see them play out every day, I don't know a single monitoring site, a single mapping project or blogging outfit, Russian, Ukrainian, or Western, that follows the war on a day-to-day basis, that would recognize this as a description, a valid description of the state of the Russian army at this time. Well, beyond that, I just asked myself the obvious question. If this is a direct quote of Gerasimov's, to whom did he make it? To Putin? To the Russian military? To someone else? To whom else? When and where and to whom is Gerasimov supposed to have said this? Now, as it happens, Gerasimov has been very visible over the last few months. I said that since the summer, he has become a lot more visible than usual. And we've had many actual statements by the actual real Gerasimov, and they've been filmed, and you can find this film on the Russian Defense Ministry's website. And we see Gerasimov talking in very friendly terms to Putin, very respectful terms to Putin himself, briefing Putin. And more importantly, perhaps for this purpose, we see Gerasimov receiving briefings from Russian military commanders and briefing Russian military commanders. And the actual Gerasimov, the real Gerasimov, the actual Gerasimov, the Gerasimov that we see in these films, not only does not talk like this, he talks in a completely opposite way. He talks with apparent growing self-confidence and conveys an impression of a Russian army that is inexorably and successfully advancing. Now, well, Seymour Hersh would say that, of course, what Gerasimov might say in private. Though again, if these are Gerasimov's private words, how have they reached the US intelligence community, who is then passing them on to Seymour Hersh? Just to say. But anyway, put that aside. Seymour Hersh might say that what Gerasimov knows and thinks and says in private might be completely different from what he says in public. Well, I wonder whether that can actually be true. I mean, how can Gerasimov, with a straight face, with every appearance of conviction, come and have discussions with senior military officials at command headquarters and appear to give them instructions that so diametrically oppose what he really thinks? I mean, the dissonance is so extreme that I frankly cannot believe it. Now, I would have said once, in fact, I did say in the past, that Seymour Hersh has written quite a lot about Gerasimov and has spoken about Gerasimov having some kind of dialogue with General Zelensky, the former Ukrainian commander of all people. I once thought that this talk about Gerasimov that's been conveyed to Hersh and is being republished by him might be an attempt to create trouble between Putin and Gerasimov. Well, all I will say about that is that these attempts, if this is what these comments about Gerasimov that appear in Seymour Hersh's articles really are about, then there's been an ongoing effort for around 2 years now, and it has been completely unsuccessful. All the indications are that Gerasimov has Putin's complete confidence, and if this is still what's going on, then the people who are trying to create trouble between these two men do need to understand that that effort has been completely unsuccessful. Anyway, that's Gerasimov. That's about the problems with this article. But let's look at other parts of this article. Parts of this article which I have to say do cause me very considerable concern, and I'm going to pick out some particular sentences which concern me. Consider these words. In Washington, there is talk of the possibility of a change at the top. US intelligence officials, who for years viewed Putin with reluctant respect for what they saw as his shrewdness and his willingness to kill to stay in power, are now wondering why Putin is continuing a war that would lead to economic chaos and a demand for new leadership. One experienced US official who has been involved in Russian issues for decades remains both mystified and frustrated by Putin's refusal last fall to accept an American offer approved by President Trump but bitterly resented by Ukraine to give Russia control of Ukrainian territory it has won in bitter fighting. And then we have other words that also seem to me to talk about other issues, that this is a stalemate situation, that the Russian economy is close to collapse. But then he goes on to say, the message in all of this is simple. Putin is now digging his country and his presidency in a hole of violence that is growing deeper and deeper. So here we have words about Putin rejecting an American offer, an American official mystified and frustrated by Putin's refusal to accept an American offer. At the start of the article, in an earlier paragraph, which I didn't read, but I will now, we read about despair and anger growing in some parts of the US intelligence community about Vladimir Putin's refusal to consider ending the war with Ukraine. So despair and anger on the part of the US intelligence community. Frustration that Putin is rejecting American offers basically to freeze the conflict along the existing conflict lines. Talk of Putin being replaced, talk of the possibility of a change at the top, references to assassinations. US intelligence officials viewed Putin with reluctant respect for what they saw as his shrewdness and willingness to kill to stay in power. References to revolution. Putin knows the ghost in the Kremlin closet is revolution. Talk about, and further talk about a whole of violence that is growing deeper and deeper. I have to say that all of this looks to me like someone trying to spread the idea that the assassination of President Putin, or at least his forcible removal from power as a result of some kind of coup, would be a good thing and in Russia's benefit, even as the real reason why this person or persons want to see Putin either assassinated or removed from power is because they are desperate and angry that he is refusing to end the war by accepting American terms. In other words, a freeze of the conflict. Now, bear in mind, all of this is being said, or is apparently being said to Hersh, just a few weeks after the Russians have complained about an attempted assassination attempt of Putin that took place in December as a result of a drone attack on his residence in Novgorod at Valdai. Well, I don't know who this person that is talking to Seymour Hersh is. I don't know how well connected this person is. I don't know what agency of the US government this person comes from. But notice that this person is talking, or appears to be talking, on behalf of the US intelligence community, which to my mind points very much to the CIA. We had a whole series of articles in the US media just a few weeks ago at the turn of the year in which the CIA straightforwardly admitted that they are behind the drone campaign that the Ukrainians have been conducting against Russia. And that appeared to me to suggest some ownership, not just over the drone attacks on the refineries and the tankers in the seas, which were expressly admitted to in this article, but some ownership, American ownership, over the drone attack in Novgorod, which admittedly the CIA are saying was not actually an assassination attempt on Putin, but an attack on a neighbouring military facility, though they won't tell us which one. So, well, that is what the Russians think, that there was an attack, an attempted assassination of Putin an attack on his residence in Novgorod. The Russians have been effectively told that the Americans are behind the drone war, and it was drones that attempted to attack the residence in Novgorod, what the Russians say. And here we have an article which seems to originate with a US intelligence official, which tells us that there are some people in the US intelligence community who would like to see President Putin removed from the scene and are prepared to contemplate the possibility that this might be done through violence. There are references to kill by Putin, by the way, but kill, revolution, whole of violence, and all of that. This coming, just as I said, a few weeks after that attack on Valdai. And all because Putin refuses to end the war on American terms. And the despair and anger which all of this is causing. Now, to my mind, this looks uncomfortably like somebody preparing the ground for justifications of future attempts to assassinate Putin. That's, I have to say, how it reads to me. Now, I'm going to be very careful, and I'm going to repeat again. I'm going to be very clear. I don't know who this person was. I don't know how representative of views in the American government he is. A lot of the other things that he said to Hersh, I regard as demonstrably untrue. I think the quote, the alleged quote from Gerasimov, is absolute fantasy. I think it's total and complete nonsense. But in the light of what has happened, especially in the light of the Valdai attacks, I find this a most disturbing article altogether. Now, why is it being publicized in this way? Why are the Americans, why are some people in the United States publishing this article? Well, as I said, firstly, it might be an attempt to provide justification for an assassination attempt against Putin. I mean, that might be what this is all about. And it could also be that this is also an attempt to create concern and worry in Russia, basically to make it even less possible for the Americans and the Russians to talk with each other, because after the Valdai attack and following this article, well, there may be people in Russia who say, what on earth are we doing talking to the Americans at all, given that we now saw with the attack on Valdai, and we see with this article by Seymour Hersh, that the Americans appear to be trying to assassinate our president. I should say that I am confident that the Russians will interpret this article in the way that I've said. Against that, it must be said that I don't know how seriously the Russians take articles by Seymour Hersh by this point. Anyway, I did find this article disturbing. We've seen the Americans do all sorts of things around the world. They were clearly involved at some level in the decapitation attack in Iran back in June. I mean, that's my view anyway. They clearly had some role also in the attempted decapitation of the Hamas leaders a little later. Again, that is my view. There is no doubt whatsoever that they carried out a decapitation strike on Venezuela, not by killing Maduro, but by capturing him. So you could say that an assassination attempt on Putin is part of the pattern. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I don't think I can say more. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been more movements on the front lines. I am not going to discuss those in Ukraine, but suffice to say that we're getting more and more reports about the latest Russian missile and drone strike on Ukraine, and it does indeed seem as if the Russians did unveil some new weapons over the course of that strike, and this was the Iskander 1000. This is a new version of the Iskander, which has a longer range, and it means that the Russians can conduct missile strikes deeper inside Ukraine using Iskander missiles than has ever been possible before. Use of the Iskander, use of land-based missiles as opposed to aircraft, especially strategic bombers launching subsonic Kh-101 missiles, has enormous advantages for the Russians because it takes away warning time from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have hours of prior warning when Tupolev 95 bombers take off from Russian strategic bomber bases and launch Kh-101 missiles, and they can prepare their air defenses and prepare take whatever steps they want to take in response, or can take in response to the incoming missiles. Because Iskander missiles fly so fast, they are ballistic missiles which do, I understand, achieve hypersonic speeds at some portions of their flight. And because they're launched from the ground, from territory that was part of pre-2022 Ukrainian territory and pre-2014 Ukrainian territory. Because of this, the Ukrainian warning times from Iskander launches is reduced to a few minutes at best. So this was a devastating strike, and as I discussed in my program yesterday, we now have extensive blackouts across Ukraine. Kiev continues to be particularly badly hit. There's apparently extensive, almost total blackouts of eastern Kiev on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, but it seems that large areas of Kiev on the west bank of the river are also cut off, are also in blackout. There's been problems with water supply again, though the Ukrainian authorities have said that the water supplies will be restored by some point today. And Mayor Klitschko has made comments which appear to suggest that already some 600,000 people have heeded his advice and have left Kiev, significantly reducing the population of that city. And of course, the longer this Russian campaign continues, the more likely it becomes that Kiev will indeed empty and that the other big cities in Ukraine will empty. And that does seem to be the Russian objective. And I've already said that this is a humanitarian disaster, and one which I'm astonished more isn't being made about in the West, but one which leaves me extremely upset and worried about. Anyway, so we have all of that. We also have further reports that yet another big Russian strike is coming. A Ukrainian commentator says that this time the Russians are going to attack the substations that transmit the power from Ukraine's nuclear power plants, which are the only electricity producers of significance left in Ukraine now. This person says that these electricity substations are situated about a kilometre away from the power stations. He expresses worry that Russian missiles might strike the nuclear power stations because they're not always accurate. That is a legitimate concern, but I would say that up to now Russian strikes have been very precise indeed, and I have to say that I think the Russians probably can strike a target that's located a kilometre away from a nuclear power plant and do so with strong confidence that they will hit the electricity substations rather than the nuclear power station itself. Anyway, we will see whether that is true. Obviously, it is the Russians who will act and who will make the decision. What a Ukrainian commentator says has to be speculation at this time. There also, however, is considerable speculation in Ukraine that another Oreshnik strike is on the way. Supposedly, there are preparations for such a strike at the Kapustin Yar Cosmodrome in Russia. Presumably, the Ukrainians are obtaining this data from the United States. That information might be more secure. Again, we will see. What I want to do now, in anticipation, perhaps to some extent of that strike, is discuss a program that I saw on Glenn Deason's channel, which was a lengthy interview with Professor Theodore Postol, who has conducted a follow-up analysis of the Oreshnik strike on Lvov. Now, I've received I've read many different accounts of this Oreshnik strike, made by many people. There was Millennium 7, the commentator on Millennium 7. There has been which is a YouTube channel. There has been the Black Mountain Analysis, which I've also discussed, which is a Substack page. I've also had all kinds of people who've emailed me with their own views. What I get to say about all of these views and commentaries is that they're all well informed. They're all written in very good faith. About that, there is no doubt at all. But Professor Postol is different from all of these other commentators, is in that he is an actual rocket scientist. His job is to design. His career has been to design ballistic missiles. I mean, he knows about these things better than, anyone outside the relatively small field of rocket scientists, of which, of course, he is one. Now, that doesn't make him infallible, but I'm going to say this. I am not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I'm certainly not a rocket scientist or anything of that sort. As people who know me will say, I am not somebody with a great deal of technical knowledge or depth of technical knowledge. But I have worked many times very, very closely with experts, and I've done this for a long time. And over the course of that, I have acquired a certain feel, a certain ability to tell when someone is an expert or a good expert and when someone is not. When somebody knows what they are talking about and when they don't. Now, listening to Professor Postol and listening to his explanations, I'm going to say this. If I had no prior knowledge of Professor Postol at all, if I knew nothing about his background, his scientific credentials, his scientific history. If I just started by watching those comments and that program and listening to what he was saying, based on my prior experience of working with experts, I would have said that this is an expert who knows what he is talking about. I mean, that is what I am going to say. And I should add that I am very, very confident indeed of that assessment. Extremely confident indeed of that assessment. And I would make that assessment, as I said, completely independently of what I already know about Professor Postol and his background and credentials. So in summary, I consider his discussion absolutely definitive and authoritative as well. So Professor Postol said a number of things, and they were very interesting. Firstly, he said that the Oreshnik is indeed a hypersonic system, that these were hypersonic warheads that struck the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro and this factory in Lvov. He said that in no conceivable sense was the damage done comparable to that of a nuclear device. Now, what I think Professor Postol does not know is that the person who set the hair running about the Oreshnik having possibly capabilities similar to those of a nuclear weapon was none other than Vladimir Putin himself. And Vladimir Putin, shortly after the first use of the Oreshnik, made all sorts of comments, and one of them, which I remember him making very well, is that though this was a conventional weapon using conventional warheads, if several Oreshnik missiles attacked the same target, the level of destruction they would cause would be comparable to a nuclear weapon. That was what Putin actually said. Important to stress again, Putin didn't say that if one weapon did this, it would have to be a group of weapons all coming together and conducting this strike at the same time. Now, I have to say, I think that here again, Putin perhaps overstated things. I remember that after the Oreshnik strike, Putin was talking quite a lot about the Oreshnik, and he was giving away, I think, more information about it than the Russian military people and scientists were happy about. And to my amazement, and almost uniquely, the Kremlin began to take back some of the statements that he had made, which they had previously published about the Oreshnik. And they even at one point stopped publishing certain of his comments, which I've never seen happen before. But anyway, all I'm saying is that Putin himself is obviously also not a rocket scientist, and it may be that and he's human, just as all of us are, he perhaps also imagined that the Oreshnik might be designed to do certain things that it really isn't designed for. So multiple attacks with many Oreshniks might not have quite the effect that Putin himself believes. So that's the first thing. I think it's the least important. Professor Postol did, however, provide a very clear analysis of the Oreshnik itself. He said that it seems to be based on a single-stage rocket missile, and the stage is the first stage, not of the Rubesh, which is a new intermediate range ballistic missile that the Russians have been designing but have not so far put into service. But the first stage of a much older missile, the Pioneer, the missile called the SS-20, which the Soviets developed in the 1960s and 1970s, and which they put into service at the end of the 1970s, and which provoked a whole issue and debate in Europe, which led directly to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which has now, of course, lapsed. So that is what he thinks about the actual core of the missile itself. More interesting is its warhead, which consists of two different stages of basically submunitions, 36 in total. Again, I'm not going to try to reproduce what Professor Postol says, but we're talking about metallic submunitions which reach the target at hypersonic speeds and do so in clusters. Now, the key thing to say about this analysis is that Professor Postol, again, as he explained after the Dnipro attack, but as he has again discussed after the Lvov attack, he says that these submunitions, because of the extraordinary speeds that they fly, the hypersonic fleets that they fly, when they hit solid, immovable objects like the ground, they instantly vaporize, creating an effect like an explosion. They do not penetrate deep below the surface. They are not, therefore, designed as deep underground penetrators. So analysis that has circulated of the Oreshniks strike on Lvov as targeting some underground bunker facility deep below the surface must be wrong. Now, I say that, I repeat again, what Professor Postol is saying struck me as being based on sound physics. I'm not a physicist, but what I do know is this: you can shape and change human laws. You cannot argue with the laws of physics. It looks as if this system is not designed for deep penetration. It is designed to destroy surface objects. But here I think is where there's been a lot of misunderstanding, because there is a view that this must mean that the weapon is not as effective as has been suggested, because it can't destroy objects deep underground, and because it's a system that works through inert submunitions, that means that it doesn't do damage. And here again, Professor Postol explained that on the contrary to surface objects which these clusters of submunitions strike, the damage done is devastating. The kinetic force, the kinetic energy that is released by the submunitions when they vaporize is extremely powerful. And given that you have 36 of them, they do extensive damage to buildings that they strike. And frankly, as he put it, you would not want to be in a building when these submunitions do strike. So I think this has to be conclusive. The attack, basically, as the Russians said, on the facility in Lvov, targeted a base complex with workshops, base facilities, perhaps aircraft parked on the accompanying runway, maybe expecting repair, and any command and control structures which might be located above the surface. And there might indeed be those. It's a misconception to assume that command and control structures, including sensitive and important ones are going to be located always and invariably deep below the surface in command bunkers, especially if there is a belief that this facility is far out of range of the missiles that the Russians can launch. Then it might be the case that the facility, including its command and control facilities, are located above the surface in buildings which would be very severely damaged by a strike of this kind. So this is the kind of weapon it is. And I'm going to suggest that, again, this is a typical Russian weapon. It uses systems that are taken off the shelf, rocket parts from old but very serviceable and, for their day, very advanced rockets designed in the 1970s, but which are still fully workable and are therefore inexpensive to put into service, and about which there may be several of these rocket stages still available in Russia that can be used for this system immediately. You would have to design the warhead part of the missile, but the Russians, who are outstanding physicists, would have little difficulty to do this. They would be every bit as familiar with the physics as Professor Postel is. The physics is, as Professor Postel said, advanced, but it is not so advanced that it is not well known within the community of scientists who design and build these kind of things. So it could be done quite quickly. Professor Postel does discuss the possibility of metallic explosives being used in these submunitions. He does talk about potential aluminium explosives based on aluminium. He appears to think that tungsten, a metal with which the Russians are very familiar and which, to my knowledge, they work with extensively, might actually be an even more effective metallic explosive to use in these submunitions. He acknowledges that if these explosives, these metallic explosives, were incorporated in the submunitions, there would be more damage done. The explosive effect would be greater, but not orders of magnitude greater. The effect would still be for structures on the surface. And, well, lastly, Professor Postel did not discuss what might happen if a much larger warhead was used, a single unitary warhead or smaller unitary warheads as opposed to submunitions. I'm not sure, by the way, whether this system is even designed to be used in that way, but let's assume it is. He didn't discuss that. But I have to say, based on what he said about the physics, it still seems to me that if you had a single unitary warhead of that kind, it would still vaporize on the surface. Its effect would still be on the surface. We would not be looking at a deep penetration device. So, given that that is so, there might not be much logic in using a unitary warhead in that way. Perhaps clusters for this kind of weapon, clusters of submunitions, make more sense. So, a devastating weapon. And Professor Postel also said that there is no mechanism, there is no means, there is no technology in existence capable of intercepting it. There is no defense to the Oreshnik. Now, he also said, interestingly, that there is almost certainly no defense to the other hypersonic missiles that the Russians use. I've seen some interesting and probably true studies that explain how, in certain unusual situations, advanced Patriot missile system might manage to destroy a Kinjal warhead as it nears the surface, because the atmospheric density would have slowed that warhead down to the point where it might be capable of being intercepted. My sense is that if this has ever happened, it has happened very infrequently. And Professor Postel also said that, well, yes, there are theoretical possibilities of shooting down Iskander missiles using Patriot missiles, but this is so difficult and so complicated that the possibility of achieving that is very low, which reinforces my long-standing belief that the Ukrainians massively exaggerate their success in shooting down Russian missiles. The Kinjal, definitely. The Iskander, almost certainly. So, just say, a devastating weapon, which is the Oreshnik, but not one used for deep penetrations, not for use to target deep bunkers located in Lvov, or the deep underground bunker that Zelensky and his officials are supposed to use in Kiev. The Russians do have weapons capable of reaching and destroying bunkers. They have massive bombs. Professor Postel talked about the Fab 1500, but of course the Russians have much heavier and more powerful bombs than that. There's the Fab 3000. And by the way, there is the simply colossal Fab 9000, which so far as I know has in this war not so far been used. Now, all of this leads us back to the possibility that the Oreshnik might be used again. Professor Postel said that he thought this was an extremely accurate and very precise weapon indeed. The evidence strongly suggests this. We've had attacks on area targets of fairly limited area in populated centres, Dnipro and Lvov, and there's been no word of damage to civilian buildings. So you can quite easily imagine that this would be the perfect weapon to use, for example, against electricity substations located a kilometre away from a nuclear power station. Though I have to say, I think it is more likely that the Russians will use one of the panoply of other weapons that they also have. Lastly, and importantly, just to say this, given that the Russians have been able to use, or appear to have used, different technologies, old rockets, or perhaps rockets that were designed in the past but can be quite easily put into production again because their character is well known, and you would not need to make significant changes to existing production lines to produce them in quantity. And because the physics of the warhead and of the submunitions are also very well known, with an enormous amount of data probably available to the Russians from earlier rocket tests, which they could use. That reinforces my view that the Oreshnik can indeed be produced in very large volumes. Maybe not 25 a month, but certainly a fair number each year. Probably more than 25 a year, probably many more than that still, just saying, at relatively low cost. And that, of course, makes it an even more powerful weapon, precisely for all of those reasons. If France, which is now talking about developing its own Oreshnik, or the United States were to try to design a weapon of this kind, I can tell you for an absolute fact that they would start from a clean sheet of paper, they would spend billions in research, they would spend an enormous amount of time developing it. They would use entirely new rocket stages and all of that. Development would be very protracted. It would last perhaps a decade, maybe longer, and you would end up with a weapon that produces the same result as the one that the Oreshnik does. That is the difference in engineering, industrial, and design philosophies. The Russians always aim for rapid production, and well, we see that here. Now, given all of this, I myself also believe that there is at least a plausible possibility that design, development, and production of the Oreshnik has all taken place in Russia over the course of the special military operation. In other words, this weapon was designed during this war precisely and principally in order to wage the war itself. Given the nature of the weapon and the way it falls well within Russian design philosophies and industrial resources, I would have thought that a 3 to 4 year development and design and production program is not beyond the realm of the possible. But that, to repeat again, is a guess. So I think this is, as I said, definitive, conclusive evidence about the Oreshnik. I think there's a lot of people who have run away with the idea that because this is a surface effect weapon rather than a deep penetration weapon, that somehow means that it is not an effective weapon. That is clearly, if you listen to Professor Postol, utterly wrong. And I would add that if the Russians can indeed produce it in quantity, given that there is no defense to it also, then that in itself is an important factor. Quantity, as has been said, has a quality all of its own. Now, this is where I'm going to finish the program today. As I said, there's a lot going on the battlefields, but as I said, I am under all kinds of pressures today, and I've had to discuss various rather general topics in this program. Even as I am making this program, I've just seen a message that Witkoff and Kushner are flying to Moscow today and are due to meet with Putin tomorrow. So there is clear urgency. And by the way, I've seen it suggested, in fact, I believe it might have been my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou who suggested it, that one of the things that appears to be happening is that Trump, especially, tied up as he now is with the Greenland, crisis, that one of his major priorities at the moment is to stabilize his relations with Putin after the damage done by the drone attack on Valdai, and that it is basically as a fence-mending exercise that Witkoff and Kushner are going to Moscow. Anyway, we shall see. There'll be a lot more from me about all of this tomorrow. But in the meantime, this is where I end my video today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Have a very good day.